The first stone was laid not in malice, but in hope. In the year 1858, sunlight fell upon the rolling hills of Weston, West Virginia, illuminating a vision of profound and radical compassion. Here, they would build a sanctuary. They would raise a monument not to war or commerce, but to the fractured human mind, a place designed to mend the soul itself. The architect's plans depicted a structure of breathtaking scale, a Gothic revival masterpiece with a central administration building and long, tiered wings stretching outward like a great bird of prey taking flight. It was to be a place of air and light and purpose, a physical manifestation of a new philosophy known as the Kirkbride Plan. In the grand speeches of the day, it was promised that this asylum would not be a prison, but a retreat, a self-contained world where ordered routine and beautiful surroundings would gently coax the troubled spirit back from the brink. They did not know that they were building a trap, a stone and mortar vessel that would one day contain not 250 souls, but 2,400. Each one a testament to the terrible speed with which a dream of healing can curdle into a nightmare of confinement. If the quiet darkness of forgotten history is a place you feel called to explore, and this is your first time crossing our threshold, consider subscribing. Become a keeper of these records and ensure you are present for the revelations yet to be unearthed. The construction spanned decades, a slow and deliberate process that seemed to mimic the very patience promised to its future inhabitants. Local stone, a pale and somber gray, was quarried from the nearby hills, each block cut and set by hand. The sound of hammers and chisels echoed through the valley for more than 20 years, a steady, rhythmic pulse that spoke of progress and unwavering belief. The town of Weston watched the structure grow, its staggered wings reaching ever further, its central clock tower climbing toward the heavens. To the local populace, it was a source of pride and of economic stability, a grand federal project that promised employment and a certain civic importance. They saw the towering edifice as a symbol of modernity, a testament to the state's commitment to the most vulnerable. They spoke of it in revered tones, calling it the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, a name that carried with it the weight of scientific authority and benevolent intention. The very architecture was a medical prescription. The long, sprawling wings were designed so that each patient's room would have a window, granting access to sunlight and fresh air, two commodities believed to be potent antidotes to melancholy and mania. The corridors were wide and airy, the ceilings vaulted, every detail meticulously planned to promote a sense of calm and order. It was a cathedral of therapy, a place where the environment itself was the primary instrument of healing. The philosophy of moral treatment, as it was called, dictated that insanity was not a permanent stain upon the soul, but a temporary affliction, one that could be cured with kindness, routine, and a tranquil setting. There were to be no chains, no dungeons, no forgotten wretches languishing in filth. Instead, there would be farming and reading and quiet contemplation. This was the promise, etched into the very stones of the asylum. It was a promise of restoration, of a return to the self, a promise that the darkness of the mind could be held at bay by the simple, healing power of light. Into this world of clinical optimism stepped Dr. Joseph Cartwright. He arrived in Weston in the autumn of 1881, just as the final sections of the asylum were being completed. He was a man whose physical presence seemed to perfectly mirror the institution he was to command. Tall, severe, with a neatly trimmed beard that was already beginning to show threads of gray, he carried himself with an air of unshakable purpose. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, seemed to absorb everything and reveal nothing. He was a product of the finest medical schools in the East, a physician who spoke of the human brain with the detached reverence of a theologian discussing the nature of God. He was a fervent believer in the moral treatment philosophy, viewing the asylum not merely as his place of employment, but as his life's great work. He saw in its gleaming marble floors and sunlit wards the perfect laboratory for his theories on mental restoration. In his private journals, he wrote of his ambition not just to manage insanity, but to understand its deepest mechanics, to map its intricate pathways, and ultimately, to conquer it. He was a man of science, a man of reason, and he believed with every fiber of his being that the chaos of the human mind could be brought to order through meticulous observation and compassionate, structured care. There was, however, a small, almost imperceptible detail about him that hinted at a different nature. A quiet, humanizing element that would later be recalled with a certain tragic irony. On his daily walks around the asylum grounds, even as he surveyed the grand, imposing structure that was his domain, he would often pause to admire the wildflowers that grew in the untended meadows beyond the manicured lawns. He was particularly drawn to a small, resilient breed of purple thistle, a plant that thrived in the harshest conditions. He once remarked to an assistant that the thistle's stubborn beauty was a perfect metaphor for the human spirit, a thing that could blossom even in the most broken and neglected of places. It was a fleeting moment of poetry from a man who otherwise dealt exclusively in the cold prose of diagnosis and pathology. This, then, was the man entrusted with the keys to this kingdom of the mind. A brilliant, ambitious doctor who saw beauty in resilience, yet whose professional gaze was fixed upon the mechanisms of human frailty. The dedication ceremony was held on a crisp October afternoon. The governor of West Virginia delivered a soaring speech from the asylum's grand portico, his voice echoing across the assembled crowd of local dignitaries, physicians, and townspeople. He spoke of a new era of enlightenment, an age where the shadows of ignorance and fear would be banished by the bright light of scientific progress. He praised the architect's vision and the builder's tireless labor. He gestured to the vast, imposing structure behind him and called it a beacon of hope, a sanctuary for the troubled mind. The asylum, he declared, stood as proof that compassion and control could walk hand in hand, that the state had a moral obligation to care for those who could not care for themselves. As the crowd applauded, Dr. Cartwright stood slightly apart from the other officials, his expression unreadable. He looked past the cheering faces, his gaze fixed on the endless rows of windows that stared back at him like 1,000 vacant eyes. He was not thinking of the speeches, or the ceremony, or the political promises. He was thinking of the work to come. He was envisioning the wards filled with patients, each one a unique puzzle to be solved, a unique set of symptoms to be cataloged and treated. He felt a profound sense of destiny, a conviction that he stood at the threshold of a great and noble enterprise. Yet, even in that moment of triumph, a subtle undercurrent of dread began to make itself felt. It was a feeling so faint, so easily dismissed, that it registered less as a thought and more as a physical sensation, like a sudden drop in temperature. Perhaps it was the way the late afternoon sun cast long, distorted shadows from the building's Gothic spires. Shadows that stretched like grasping fingers across the manicured lawns. Perhaps it was the sheer, overwhelming scale of the place, a scale that seemed to dwarf the very individuals it was meant to serve. The architect had designed a city unto itself, a self-sufficient world of wards, kitchens, workshops, and farmland. It was a testament to his ambition, but it was also a design that presupposed a level of funding and staffing that was, even then, beginning to seem optimistic. A state auditor's preliminary report, buried deep within a stack of administrative documents, had already raised concerns about the long-term operational costs. The report hinted that the asylum's vastness might one day become its greatest liability. It was a small, discordant note in an otherwise harmonious chorus of praise, a bureaucratic whisper that hinted at a future where the promise of individual care would be crushed by the weight of institutional necessity. What, the auditor had rhetorically asked in a private memorandum, happens when the number of souls in need of sanctuary exceeds the resources allocated for their salvation? The question hung in the air, unanswered, a ghost of a problem yet to come. It was a question that foretold a time when the asylum's carefully designed spaces of healing would become zones of confinement, when the light pouring through the windows would serve only to illuminate the depths of a despair that no amount of architecture could ever hope to cure. As night fell, the crowds dispersed, leaving the great building to settle into a profound and unnerving silence. The gas lamps cast a weak, flickering glow upon the empty corridors, their light swallowed by the immense, cavernous darkness. Dr. Cartwright, unable to rest, left his office and began to walk the deserted wards. His footsteps echoed on the polished floors, the sound amplified by the stillness, creating the unsettling impression that he was being followed. He moved from wing to wing, from floor to floor, a solitary figure in a vast, sleeping kingdom. Moonlight streamed through the tall, barred windows, painting stark, geometric patterns of shadow on the walls and floors. The effect was hypnotic, transforming the therapeutic spaces into something far more ambiguous, a grid of cages waiting to be filled. The doctor paused in the center of a large, circular ward, one of the many designed to allow for constant observation. He ran a hand along the cool, smooth plaster of the wall, his mind already at work. He was not seeing an empty room. He was seeing a controlled environment. He was picturing the beds, arranged in perfect, symmetrical rows. He was imagining the patients, each one a variable in a grand and complex equation. His initial optimism, the compassionate zeal that had defined his public remarks, was slowly giving way to a colder, more clinical perspective. The humanizing warmth he had felt observing the wildflowers was receding, replaced by the detached focus of the scientist. In his mind, the men and women who would soon populate these halls were ceasing to be individuals defined by their personal histories and private sorrows. They were becoming case files. They were becoming subjects. He pulled a small leather-bound notebook from his coat pocket and, by the pale light of the moon, began to make notes. He did not write of comfort or of healing. He wrote of observation, of classification, of behavioral modification. He used phrases like mental repair and neurological repatterning. His handwriting, usually so precise, took on a feverish, hurried quality. He was designing a system, a rigid and unyielding methodology for imposing order on the chaos of the mind. The asylum, in that moment, began its subtle transformation. It ceased to be merely a sanctuary. It was becoming a laboratory. As he stood there, alone in the echoing darkness, a new and unsettling thought began to form in the doctor's mind. What if the cure for madness was not kindness, but control? What if the most effective way to repair a broken mind was not to nurture it, but to dismantle it and rebuild it from its very foundations? The question was both thrilling and terrifying, a professional inquiry that skirted the edges of a profound moral abyss. He closed his notebook, the sound of the leather cover snapping shut startlingly loud in the silence. The dream of moral treatment was already beginning to curdle into an obsession with mechanical precision. The first wave of patients had not yet arrived, but the intellectual groundwork for the horrors to come was already being laid, here in the dark, in the mind of the one man who held the power to turn a house of healing into a factory of despair. The promise of light, born in the mid-19th century, had, by the mid-20th, been utterly consumed by shadow. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, conceived as a spacious haven for 250 souls, was, by the 1950s, a hermetically sealed world of torment for nearly 2,400. The official census records from that decade tell a story not in words, but in the cold, unyielding language of numbers, a story of catastrophic failure. One must imagine the archivist's hands, years later, turning the brittle, yellowed pages of the asylum's ledgers. The early entries are written in a neat, confident script, the patient numbers climbing slowly, well within the institution's generous capacity. But then, as the years turn, the script becomes hurried, cramped. The numbers begin to spill over their designated lines, notations squeezed into margins, the ink bleeding as if in protest. 250 becomes 500. 500 becomes 1,000. 1,000 becomes 1,500, then 2,000, then more. The mathematics are simple, but the reality they represent is a descent into an inferno. The architectural principles of the Kirkbride Plan, the very foundation of its therapeutic promise, were not merely ignored, they were inverted. A building designed for space and air became a monument to compression and suffocation. Every square foot of its once majestic corridors was repurposed for human storage. What were once sunlit parlors, intended for quiet reading and gentle socialization, were now packed with dozens of rusted iron cots, arranged so tightly that one could not walk between them. Mattresses, stained and thin, lined the hallways, turning passages of transit into permanent, squalid dormitories where the ambulatory had to step over the inert. The grand staircases became vertical slums, with patients sleeping huddled on the landings, chained by a wrist or an ankle to the ornate balustrades. A room designed for a single occupant now housed 4 or 5 or 6, the air thick with the combined heat of their bodies and the stench of their unwashed linen. The promise of a window for every patient became a cruel joke. For the vast majority, the only view was of another human being, in close, suffocating proximity. The only air they breathed already exhaled by a dozen others. The asylum was no longer a retreat. It had become a human warehouse, a place where the mentally ill were not treated, but stacked. Into this suffocating ecosystem came a young nurse, one of the many hired in a desperate and ultimately futile attempt to manage the ever-swelling tide of humanity. She arrived, like Dr. Cartwright before her, with a sense of purpose, a belief in the institution's founding ideals, which were still espoused in the nursing textbooks of the era. She was given a crisp, white uniform and a tour of the administration building, a part of the asylum that still retained a semblance of its former dignity, with its polished wood and quiet, ordered offices. But the moment she passed through the locked doors that separated the administrative wing from the patient wards, she entered another reality. The first thing that struck her was the sound. It was not the sound of a hospital, but of a factory. A relentless, deafening cacophony of moans, shrieks, weeping, and the constant low hum of thousands of whispered conversations. The second was the smell. It was a thick, complex odor, a layering of unwashed bodies, stale food, human waste, and the sharp chemical scent of institutional disinfectant. A perfume that did not cleanse but only highlighted the underlying decay. The heat was oppressive, a damp, clinging warmth that seemed to rise from the very stones, a product of overcrowding and poor ventilation. Her first assignment was in a ward originally designed for 20 patients that now held over 100. She saw individuals who had not been outside in years, their skin a pale, almost translucent white. She saw patients rocking endlessly in corners, their minds having retreated to a place where the chaos could not reach them. The system of moral treatment had completely collapsed under the sheer weight of numbers. There was no more therapy. There was no more farming or reading or structured routine. There was only containment. The nursing staff, hopelessly outnumbered, had long since abandoned any pretense of providing care. Their daily routine was a brutal exercise in logistics, distributing meager rations of food, hosing down the filthy floors, and breaking up the violent altercations that inevitably erupted in such close quarters. The nurses themselves were breaking. The young nurse would see older, more experienced colleagues staring into space, their faces etched with a permanent expression of exhaustion and despair. She saw them move with a mechanical, joyless efficiency, their compassion eroded by the daily confrontation with an ocean of human misery they were powerless to assuage. They were no longer healers. They were jailers, and they knew it. Food shortages became a chronic and defining feature of life within the asylum. The kitchens, designed to prepare meals for a few hundred, were now tasked with feeding a small city. The quality of the food deteriorated until it was little more than a tasteless, starchy gruel, ladled from enormous, dented vats into tin bowls. There was never enough. The distribution of meals was a twice-daily ritual of controlled violence. Patients would fight for their portion, the stronger preying on the weak, the staff using wooden batons to maintain a fragile temporary order. Malnutrition was rampant, contributing to the spread of diseases like tuberculosis and dysentery, which swept through the overcrowded wards with terrifying speed. In this crucible of hunger and confinement, violence became the primary form of communication. Territorial disputes over a few square feet of floor space could end in bloodshed. The slightest perceived provocation could trigger an explosion of rage. The walls bore the physical scars of this constant strife. Dents in the plaster, dark, suspicious stains on the floorboards, the lingering memory of countless desperate struggles. The young nurse learned quickly to distinguish the different sounds of violence: the wet smack of a fist on flesh, the sharp crack of a bone, the high-purity scream of sudden, unendurable pain. She learned to patch wounds, to set simple fractures, to document injuries with a detached clinical hand, knowing that no real justice would ever be sought or delivered. The asylum had become a lawless state, its own sovereign territory of madness, operating beyond the reach of conventional morality. For the patients, it was a world without hope, a daily struggle for survival in which the only certainty was that tomorrow would be the same as today, or worse. They were trapped, not only by the locked doors and barred windows, but by their own minds and by a system that had forgotten them. They were the anonymous, spectral population of a failed utopia, their individual tragedies dissolving into a single, massive statistic of suffering. Dr. Cartwright, now decades older, observed the collapse of his ordered world with a growing sense of intellectual fury. From the detached calm of his office, he saw the chaos not as a human tragedy, but as a catastrophic system failure. His dream of a perfectly regulated therapeutic environment had devolved into a teeming, uncontrollable bedlam. The principles of moral treatment, he concluded, were a luxury, a philosophy designed for a world that no longer existed. The problem, as he saw it, was the sheer, unmanageable volume of insanity. The patients were no longer individuals to be gently guided back to reason. They were a diseased mass, a tide of neurological dysfunction that threatened to overwhelm his institution entirely. His ambition had not waned with age. It had only hardened, calcified. The compassion that had once led him to admire wildflowers had been replaced by a chilling pragmatism. If the environment could no longer control the patient, then he would have to find a way to control the patient's mind directly. It was in this period that the first experimental treatments were introduced, not with a formal announcement, but quietly, insidiously, presented to the overworked staff as new, more efficient methods of pacification. Hydrotherapy, once a gentle treatment involving warm baths, was transformed into a punitive ordeal. Patients deemed disruptive were strapped to gurneys and subjected to hours-long sprays of ice-cold water from a high-pressure hose, a practice that could induce hypothermia and shock. Insulin coma therapy, a dangerous and controversial procedure, was employed with increasing frequency, not for its dubious therapeutic benefits, but for its ability to render a troublesome patient unconscious for hours at a time. The most significant innovation, however, was the doctor's work with electroconvulsive therapy. The early devices were crude, unreliable contraptions assembled in a locked room in the asylum's basement. But to Cartwright, they represented a tool of immense potential. They were a way to directly interface with the brain's electrical pathways to interrupt the patterns of madness at their source. He began to see the overcrowded wards as a vast, unparalleled research opportunity, a living library of neurological disorders. He started to select patients, not for treatment, but for study. His choices dictated by the uniqueness of their symptoms, rather than their need for care. He required an assistant for this new, clandestine work, someone with medical training, a steady hand, and an unquestioning disposition. He chose the young nurse. Her transition from caregiver to research assistant was gradual. At first, she was simply asked to help prepare patients for what the doctor called advanced calming therapies. She would wheel them down to a secluded surgical theater in the asylum's west wing, a room that was kept locked and was not part of the regular staff's domain. She would help strap them to a heavy wooden table, her hands trembling slightly as she fastened the thick leather restraints. She would watch as the doctor, his face illuminated by a single bare overhead bulb, would apply the electrodes to the patient's temples. He told her it was necessary. He explained, in long, detached monologues, that these procedures were a humane alternative to lifelong confinement. He said he was on the verge of a breakthrough, a discovery that would revolutionize the treatment of mental illness. He used the language of science to sanitize the brutality of his methods, and the young nurse, intimidated by his authority and desperate to find some meaning in the surrounding chaos, initially believed him. She recorded his notes, her pen scratching across the pages of his research ledger, documenting dosages, seizure durations, and post-procedure behavioral changes. She tried to see what he saw, to view the terrified individuals on the table as clinical data points, as necessary sacrifices for the greater good. But she could not ignore the evidence of her own eyes, the burn marks left by the electrodes, the vacant, lifeless expressions of those who had undergone the procedure multiple times, the haunting sense that she was not participating in an act of healing, but in an act of desecration. The moral line was crossed one sweltering afternoon in July. A female patient, one who had been admitted for what the records described as simple melancholia, had vanished from her ward. Such disappearances were not uncommon. In the chaos, individuals could get lost, their absence unnoticed for days. But this time, the young nurse knew where the woman had gone. She had escorted her to the doctor's surgical theater the previous evening. Later that day, she saw Dr. Cartwright reviewing the patient's file. He took his pen, dipped it in a pot of black ink, and drew a single, thick line through the woman's name. Then, in the margin, he wrote 2 words, "Repurposed for study." It was a quiet, bureaucratic act, the stroke of a pen on a piece of paper. But in that moment, the nurse understood the full, monstrous scope of the doctor's ambition. The asylum was no longer just a warehouse for the forgotten. It was a hunting ground. This was the beginning of the true medical justification, the moment when treatment officially became torture, and the doctor's dark experiments, fueled by an endless supply of human subjects, could begin in earnest. The asylum's west wing had long been abandoned to the slow work of dust and decay, its corridors silent, its wards empty. But within this forgotten section, one room remained in active, secret use. It was a former surgical theater, a space that had been quietly and methodically converted into something else entirely. Dr. Joseph Cartwright, in the sterile and detached language of his private notes, referred to it as the resonance chamber. The name was his own invention, a clinical euphemism for a place of profound and systematic horror. The room was no longer a theater of healing. The tiered observation gallery where students once sat had been walled off, the windows blacked out with thick sheets of iron. The walls, once a clean antiseptic white, were now covered in strange acoustic paneling, designed not to absorb sound, but to manage it, to focus it. At the center of the room, bolted directly to the stained tile floor, was the heavy wooden table with its thick leather restraints. Above it, the old surgical lamp had been modified, its single, brilliant beam replaced with a cluster of low-wattage bulbs that cast a sickly, jaundiced light. But the most significant alteration was the machinery. Against the far wall sat a collection of humming, buzzing devices, their dials and gauges glowing faintly in the gloom. They were the doctor's prototypes, cobbled together from scavenged radio parts, medical equipment, and components of his own design. A constant low-frequency hum emanated from them, a sound that seemed to press in on the ears, to vibrate in the bones of the jaw. It was the sound of broken science, of an intellect that had severed all ties with compassion. The air in the resonance chamber was thick with a unique and nauseating perfume, the sharp, clean scent of carbolic acid failing to mask the coppery tang of old blood and the faint, unmistakable odor of scorched flesh. Dr. Cartwright's ambition, now untethered from any ethical or professional restraint, had found its perfect, isolated workshop. On a small steel tray beside the operating table, he would arrange his instruments with the meticulous care of a master craftsman. They were not the tools of a physician, but of a butcher who dreamed he was a watchmaker. There was a set of leucotums, slender steel rods with a retractable wire loop at the end, designed to be inserted through the eye socket and into the frontal lobe of the brain. There was an instrument that resembled a common ice pick, its handle wrapped in dirty linen for a better grip, its point sharpened to a needle's fineness. This, his notes explained, was for a procedure he termed a transorbital lobotomy, a method he praised for its speed and efficiency, requiring no anesthetic and leaving no visible scar save for the bruising around the eyes. Alongside these implements of surgical violation lay the components of his primary obsession, the electroconvulsive therapy machine. It was a crude, volatile device, a wooden box from which a tangle of wires snaked out to a pair of metal electrodes. The doctor was constantly modifying it, adjusting the voltage, experimenting with the duration and frequency of the electrical pulses. He was not seeking a therapeutic shock. He was seeking something else. He believed that a carefully calibrated jolt of electricity, delivered directly to the prefrontal cortex, could effectively erase a personality, wiping the slate clean of all its aberrant thoughts and behaviors. He was not trying to cure madness. He was trying to delete it. His notes from this period are filled with a chilling, dispassionate language. He wrote of the human brain as if it were a faulty electrical circuit, a mechanism to be rewired and repaired. The screams of his subjects were recorded as vocalizations. The violent, thrashing convulsions were noted as involuntary motor responses. He was a man documenting his own descent into monstrosity, yet he wrote with the unwavering conviction of a pioneer charting a new and glorious frontier. The nurse, his research assistant, was his sole accomplice in these endeavors. Her complicity was a silent, creeping thing, a poison she willingly ingested each day. Her duties were simple and repetitive. She would bring the selected patient to the chamber. She would secure the restraints, her movements practiced and efficient, her eyes carefully avoiding the terrified gaze of the person strapped to the table. She would prepare the instruments, cleaning them in a basin of alcohol, the clink of steel on porcelain, the only sound to break the oppressive hum of the machines. During the procedures, she would stand at the doctor's side, handing him the requested tool, recording his observations in the research ledger. Her, Handwriting, once so clear and steady, became a jagged, almost illegible scrawl. She was documenting a catalog of atrocities, yet she forced her hand to move, to form the words, to give a false, scientific legitimacy to the suffering she was witnessing. A profound and suffocating guilt became her constant companion. It was a physical weight, a pressure in her chest that made it difficult to breathe. She began to suffer from insomnia. Her nights filled with the phantom echoes of the resonance chamber. The hum, the screams, the wet, clicking sound of the Lucatum being deployed. In the asylum's crowded mess hall, she could not eat, the sight of the bland, starchy food turning her stomach. She saw the faces of the patients she had helped restrain in the faces of strangers. She began to understand that she was as much a prisoner as any of them, chained not to a bed, but to her own terrible knowledge. She considered fleeing, simply walking out of the asylum's great iron gates and never looking back. But fear held her in place. Fear of Dr. Cartwright, a man who had absolute power within these walls and who knew her secret. And a deeper, more insidious fear that the madness she was witnessing every day was somehow contagious, that it had already begun to infect her own mind, and that there was no place in the outside world for a person so tainted. And so she stayed, a ghost in a white uniform, her silence her sin, her presence her penance. The doctor's research required a focal point, a single consistent subject upon whom he could test his evolving theories without the distraction of biological variables. He found his ideal candidate in the early spring of 1953. She was a young woman who had been admitted for what the initial diagnosis termed acute anxiety with mild dissociative episodes. She was quiet, lucid, and physically healthy. In the asylum's vast ocean of psychosis and violent mania, she was a barely perceptible ripple. But to Dr. Cartwright, she was perfect. She was a clean canvas. He assigned her a case number, 472. From that moment on, her name, her history, her humanity were erased. She became a designation, a set of clinical parameters to be measured and manipulated. The patient-designated Case 472 became the central, tragic figure in the doctor's private masterpiece of horror. The experiments began with low-voltage electroshock treatments. The nurse would record the doctor's observations in the ledger. Entry after entry detailed the patient's initial responses: disorientation, memory loss, a growing emotional flatness. The doctor interpreted these results as a success. He wrote that the treatment was effectively disrupting the neurological pathways responsible for her anxiety. He was not revealing her madness. He was meticulously, scientifically, creating it. As the weeks turned into months, the procedures escalated in their intensity and their barbarity. The voltage was increased. The frequency of the treatments grew from weekly to daily. When the patient's mind and body began to break down under the strain, exhibiting violent tremors and incoherent vocalizations, the doctor did not see a human being in agony. He saw new, more complex symptoms to be treated. He progressed to his surgical instruments. He performed a series of transorbital lobotomies, each one documented with the same cold, clinical precision. He noted changes in her personality, the gradual erosion of her ability to speak, the emergence of a profound and terrifying passivity. He was not healing her. He was hollowing her out, systematically dismantling the person she had been, leaving only a vacant, breathing shell. The nurse watched it all, her pen scratching across the page, her soul dying with every word she wrote. She saw the light in the young woman's eyes extinguish, replaced by a dull, unseeing emptiness. She saw the living embodiment of the doctor's theories, and it was a vision of absolute hell. The breaking point arrived on a cold, rain-swept night in late autumn. The nurse had been tasked with filing the day's research notes in the doctor's office. The room was empty, the doctor having been called away to a meeting with the asylum's board of trustees. She was alone with the records, the complete, documented history of his atrocities. A terrible, reckless curiosity seized her. She knew the doctor had recently begun a new ledger, one that outlined his plans for the next phase of his research. He had spoken of expanding his subject pool, of applying the methods perfected on Case 472 to a wider, more varied selection of patients. The ledger was lying on his desk, a thick, black book bound in cheap leather. Her hand shook as she opened it. The first page contained a list of case numbers, 20 in all, each one followed by a series of coded notations indicating the proposed course of treatment. She read the first number, then the second, then the third. They were all patients she recognized from the wards, individuals she had spoken to, had cared for in her previous life as a nurse. A cold dread began to seep into her bones. She ran her finger down the list, her heart pounding against her ribs. And then she saw it. Near the bottom of the page, written in the doctor's precise, elegant script, was not a case number, but a name. Her name. Beside it was a single, chilling notation. Prime candidate for advanced residence study. In that instant, the last vestiges of her denial, her fear, her complicity were burned away. She was not his assistant. She was not his confidant. She was merely the next specimen. She finally understood that in this kingdom of the mad, the sane were simply the last to be diagnosed. She closed the ledger, her mind clear and cold with a terrifying new purpose. She would no longer be a silent witness. She would become a recorder of a different kind. She would create her own record, a secret history of this place, a testament to what had been done here. It was a decision born not of hope, but of pure, undiluted necessity. It was the only weapon she had left. The discovery of her own name on the doctor's list did not break the nurse. It forged her. The terror that had paralyzed her for months was transmuted into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. She was no longer a participant, no longer a victim in waiting. She was an archivist of a secret war, a chronicler of the damned, and her rebellion would be an act of meticulous, clandestine documentation. Her first challenge was the acquisition of materials, a task that in the outside world would be trivial. But within the sealed economy of the asylum was a perilous undertaking. Paper was a controlled commodity, its use monitored, its supply limited. So she became a scavenger. She stole blank pages from the back of old nursing logs, their corners brittle and yellowed with age. She carefully sliced the end papers from discarded books in the asylum's neglected library. Her greatest prize was a stack of unused patient intake forms she discovered in a damp, forgotten storage closet, their printed lines and boxes providing a cruel, ironic template for the truths she was about to record. For ink, she used a fountain pen, refilling its reservoir from a bottle she kept hidden in her footlocker, a small, personal luxury that had now become a weapon. She wrote in stolen moments, in the fleeting pockets of privacy the asylum afforded. She would lock herself in a lavatory, the reek of ammonia and despair thicken the air, and brace a salvaged page against the cold, tiled wall, her pen flying across the paper. She wrote in the dead of night, huddled under a single, thin blanket in her cot in the nurse's dormitory. A small flashlight shielded by her hand. Its beam a tiny circle of defiant illumination in the oppressive darkness. Her record was not a diary of her feelings, not a testament to her own fear and guilt. To do so would have been a self-indulgence she could not afford. Instead, she mirrored the clinical detachment of Dr. Cartwright himself, turning his own scientific method against him. Her entries were precise, factual, and damning. She recorded dates and times. She listed the case numbers of the patients taken to the resonance chamber. She described the instruments used, the voltage settings on the electroshock machine, the duration of the seizures. She documented the physical aftermath, the burns, the bruises, the vacant stares. She recounted fragments of conversations she overheard, the doctor's chilling justifications for his work, his musings on the nature of what he called cerebral compliance. She was creating a counterledger, a shadow archive that told the true story of the asylum's West Wing. And as she wrote, she faced the constant, terrifying problem of concealment. The doctor's paranoia was a palpable force in the asylum, his gaze sweeping every room, his mind constantly searching for any sign of disloyalty. Her hidden documents were a death sentence, and she knew it. So she sought out the asylum's dead spaces, the small architectural voids that exist in any building of such age and scale. She pried loose a section of plaster behind her own cot, creating a small, dark cavity where she could stash a handful of folded pages. In the asylum's rarely used chapel, a place of peeling paint and holy silence, she found a row of old hymnals, their spines broken, their pages swollen with damp. She carefully sliced a hollow space into the center of a thick, leather-bound Bible, transforming the sacred text into a secret repository for her profane truths. She became a student of hiding places, a connoisseur of cracks and shadows, her every movement dictated by the need to keep her growing archive safe from the doctor's inevitable suspicion. Dr. Cartwright, for his part, began to feel a subtle but profound shift in the atmosphere of his domain. The absolute control he had cultivated for so long was being challenged, not by an open act of rebellion, but by something far more unsettling. A change in the quality of the silence that surrounded him. He began to sense a watchfulness in the eyes of his assistant. Her movements were the same, her obedience as prompt as ever. But her presence in a room now felt different, charged with a quiet intensity he could not decipher. His paranoia, once a purely intellectual exercise directed at his patients, now turned inward, becoming a personal and consuming affliction. He started to see patterns where there were none. A misplaced instrument on his tray, a momentary hesitation in her response to an order, a flicker of an unreadable emotion in her eyes. These were no longer trivial occurrences. They were potential signals, hints of a conspiracy he could not yet prove. His sense of being observed became so acute that he began to take countermeasures against a threat that was, for now, entirely imaginary. He installed a new, heavy lock on the door to the resonance chamber. He began dismissing the nurse from the room for longer periods, preferring to work alone with his subjects, his secrets held close. He would stop mid-sentence during his monologues, turning his head sharply as if to catch a whisper in the corridor outside. The asylum, which he had always viewed as his personal laboratory, now felt like a theater of whispers, each one directed at him. He became obsessed with his own records, spending hours in his office rereading his ledgers, cross-referencing dates and notations, searching for some clerical error, some small inconsistency that might betray a hidden hand at work. His descent into paranoia was quiet and methodical. He began to destroy evidence. He started with the oldest files, the records of his earliest, crudest experiments. He would carry the brittle manila folders to the asylum's furnace late at night, feeding them to the flames one by one, watching as the documented proof of his long journey into monstrosity turned to gray, fluttering ash. It was an act of purification, an attempt to prune the past, to isolate the present from a history he now feared could be used against him. He was a man sealing the hatches on a sinking ship, unaware that the water was already inside. A new character entered this claustrophobic drama, a man who was, in his own way, as much a creature of the asylum as the doctor or the nurse. He was the archivist, a stooped, elderly man who had worked for over 40 years in the asylum's cavernous basement, the official keeper of the institution's memory. His world was one of floor-to-ceiling shelves, of crumbling cardboard boxes and thick, dust-covered ledgers. The air in his domain was cool and dry, smelling of old paper, decaying leather, and time itself. He was a man who possessed a single, humanizing passion. He loved the physical objects of his collection with a quiet, reverent intensity. He would run his fingers over the embossed covers of 19th century record books, admire the elegant cursive of a long-dead superintendent, and inhale the scent of old ink as if it were a fine perfume. He was the guardian of a million secrets, yet he had no interest in their content. He cared only for their preservation. The nurse, in her desperate search for more paper, made her way down to his subterranean kingdom. She presented him with a forged requisition slip, a request for a box of obsolete administrative forms from the 1920s. The archivist examined the slip, his watery eyes peering through thick spectacles. He saw nothing in the nurse's face but a fellow functionary engaged in the mundane business of the institution. He led her through the narrow aisles of his library of sorrow, his footsteps shuffling softly on the concrete floor. He located the requested box, blew a thick layer of dust from its lid, and with a small, proud smile, presented it to her. He had no idea that he was handing her the ammunition for a revolution. He was a man so focused on the vessel that he had become completely blind to the poison it contained. The end of this chapter of the asylum's history came not with a confession or a confrontation, but with fire. It began in the West Wing, late one winter night. The initial accounts were confused, contradictory. Some claimed to have heard a loud noise, a pop and a fizz from the direction of the resonance chamber. Others spoke of a strange, acrid smell that had lingered in the corridors for days. Whatever the cause, the result was a slow, insidious blaze that spread not with open flames, but with thick, choking smoke. It was a fire that did not roar, but whispered, creeping through the walls, blackening the ceilings, consuming the records of the doctor's work with a quiet, inexorable hunger. Alarms rang, their sound muffled and distant in the sprawling complex. Staff rushed to evacuate the nearest wards, the patients dazed and confused, their faces smudged with soot. By the time the local fire brigade arrived and managed to contain the blaze, the West Wing was a ruin. The resonance chamber was a blackened skeleton of a room. The doctor's machines melted into unrecognizable sculptures of fused metal and wire. His office was a swamp of charred paper and black water, the contents of his filing cabinets reduced to a pulpy, illegible slurry. Hundreds of records, perhaps thousands, were gone forever, turned to smoke and ash. The fire was an act of erasure, a final, violent cauterization of the asylum's most secret wound. An official investigation was launched, a brief, perfunctory affair conducted by overworked state officials who were already inclined to view the asylum as a lost cause. Dr. Cartwright, calm and articulate, presented them with a plausible explanation. He spoke of the building's aging electrical systems, of the immense power drain from his therapeutic equipment. He suggested it was a tragic but unavoidable accident. The investigators, faced with the overwhelming chaos of the asylum and the doctor's unshakable professional authority, accepted his version of events. Their final report cited faulty wiring as the official cause. But in the smoldering ruins of his laboratory, investigators found one last curious piece of evidence. The doctor had recently begun to make audio recordings of his experimental sessions. Tucked away in a fireproof safe, they found a small collection of wax cylinders, the doctor's final recordings. The asylum's board, eager to close this embarrassing chapter, ordered its closure. But the order was a hollow gesture. There was no funding for the transfer of 2,000 patients. There was nowhere for them to go. And so, The great iron gates remained locked. The fire had destroyed the records, but the patients, the living evidence of the doctor's dark work, remained inside, abandoned to whatever future the decaying walls of the asylum would grant them. The fire in the West Wing did not cleanse the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. It merely cauterized a single wound, leaving the larger body to fester. The official order for the institution's closure was a document of profound and cynical fiction. It was a piece of paper filed in a distant state capital, a bureaucratic gesture that allowed the government to wash its hands of a problem it no longer had the will or the resources to solve. For the 2,400 souls still trapped within the asylum's walls, the order changed nothing. In fact, it sealed their fate, transforming their prison from a place of brutal, mismanaged care into a forgotten tomb where the living were left to haunt the ruins alongside the ghosts of the dead. The funding, which had already been a trickle, dried up completely. Shipments of food, medicine, and coal for the massive boilers that heated the sprawling complex simply stopped arriving. The last of the senior medical staff, including Dr. Cartwright, were quietly reassigned, their departure unannounced, their absence noticed only when they failed to appear for their morning rounds. A skeleton crew of orderlies and a few hardened, spiritually exhausted nurses were left behind, not to care for the patients, but to guard the gates, to ensure that the madness contained within did not spill out into the quiet, bucolic world of Weston, West Virginia. The great iron locks on the asylum's gates were not unlocked. They were reinforced. The state had not closed the institution. It had simply walled it off from the rest of humanity, leaving it to collapse in on itself, a self-contained ecosystem of despair left to consume its own. Winter descended upon the asylum that year with a particular and unforgiving ferocity. Snow, thick and silent, blanketed the grounds, muffling the sounds of the outside world, deepening the profound sense of isolation. Without coal for the furnaces, a deep, penetrating cold seeped into the building's very stones. Frost bloomed on the inside of the barred windows, intricate, crystalline patterns that mocked the memory of sunlight. The patients, clad in thin, threadbare cotton uniforms, huddled together for warmth, their breath pluming in the frigid air of the unheated wards. The initial response to this new, final abandonment was a period of eerie, unnatural quiet. The usual cacophony of shrieks and moans subsided, replaced by a low, communal hum of shivering and whispered prayers. The last vestiges of the old institutional routine dissolved within days. The twice-daily distribution of food, which had for so long provided the only structure to their existence, ceased. The kitchens were empty, the great cooking vats cold and silent. A new, more primal order began to assert itself, dictated not by the ringing of a bell, but by the gnawing agony of starvation. The patients, left to their own devices, began to scavenge. They broke into the locked pantries, their initial finds a meager bounty of stale bread, weevily flour, and a few jars of preserved vegetables. When that was gone, they turned on the asylum itself. They ripped open the thin mattresses, searching for straw, which they would attempt to boil into a tasteless, watery soup. They caught rats in the darkened corridors, their small, desperate acts of hunting a grotesque parody of the self-sufficiency the asylum's founders had once envisioned. In the absence of any external authority, a new and brutal social structure emerged from the chaos. The sprawling complex fractured into a collection of warring tribes, their territories defined by a particular wing or a specific floor. These territories were ruled not by the most lucid, but by the most violent. Gangs of the physically strong preyed upon the weak, hoarding what little food could be found, enforcing their will with fists and makeshift weapons. The long, echoing corridors became battlegrounds, the site of savage, desperate skirmishes over a stolen blanket or a piece of dry bread. The weak, the elderly, the catatonic were the first to perish. They died quietly, in corners, their bodies often remaining undiscovered for days, their passing unnoticed and unmourned. The remaining staff, now prisoners themselves, barricaded themselves in the administration wing, armed with what few tools they could find. They subsisted on the last of the canned goods from the executive kitchen, listening to the sounds of the collapsing society just beyond their locked doors. They were no longer guards. They were survivors, waiting for a rescue that would never come. The asylum had become a medieval fiefdom, a place where the thinnest veneer of civilization had been stripped away, revealing the raw, unmediated horror of human nature pushed to its absolute limit. It was a world governed by the simple, brutal laws of survival, a monument not to the healing of the mind, but to its complete and utter disintegration. The fate of the nurse, the secret archivist, is not recorded in any official document. Her existence, like that of so many others, was erased by the asylum's final chaotic chapter. But her story did not end in silence. A single, small journal was discovered years later by a team of historical preservationists, tucked inside the hollowed-out Bible she had used as a hiding place in the asylum's chapel. The journal's final entries, written in a faint, spidery script, provide the only known account of her last days. Her final entry is not a plea for help, nor is it a cry of despair. It is a work of profound and heartbreaking observation, the last report from a witness who refused to look away. She describes the cold, the hunger, the rise of the violent hierarchies. She writes of the silence of the doctors, the disappearance of the familiar routines, the growing realization that they had all been left to die. She no longer writes of Dr. Cartwright or the resonance chamber. Her focus is on the small, human tragedies unfolding around her. She describes watching an elderly woman, a patient she had once cared for, share her last piece of bread with a younger, weeping girl. She writes of a group of men who, in a moment of shared, hallucinatory grace, began to sing old hymns in the frozen darkness of a communal ward, their voices thin and reedy, but for a moment, beautiful. Her last entry is dated simply the 13th day of snow. She writes that she has left the relative safety of the barricaded administration wing. She feels a moral obligation, she explains, to be with the patients, to record what is happening to them until the very end. The final sentence is brief, almost poetic in its stark finality. She wrote that the world has forgotten us, but this place will remember. After that, the pages are blank. The journal offers no clue as to her ultimate fate. Whether she starved, or froze, or fell victim to the violence, is a secret the asylum has kept. Her final act was one of witness, a quiet insistence that the story of these forgotten souls be preserved, even if only for the ghosts that would inherit the crumbling halls. Her journal is not just a record of suffering. It is a testament to the resilience of the human impulse to observe, to record, to make sense of the senseless, even in the face of absolute oblivion. Years passed. The asylum stood silent, a hulking, Gothic skeleton against the West Virginia sky. The town of Weston, which had once taken such pride in the grand institution on the hill, now did its best to ignore it. It was a place of bad memories, of local ghost stories told to frighten children. Weeds grew thick and high on the once manicured lawns, slowly reclaiming the land. Windows were shattered, by vandals or by the slow, relentless pressure of the changing seasons. Paint peeled from the walls in long, leprous strips. Doors rotted on their hinges. The asylum was a dead thing, a place where time itself seemed to have stopped. But the world outside did not forget it entirely. A new kind of interest began to grow, an interest born of morbid curiosity and the burgeoning subculture of urban exploration. Young people with cameras and flashlights drawn by the asylum's dark reputation, began to find ways past the rusted gates and crumbling perimeter walls. They came seeking a thrill, a brush with the forbidden, a chance to capture images of a world in decay. They moved through the dead corridors like archaeologists of the immediate past, their flashlight beams cutting through the thick, absolute darkness. They photographed the rows of rusted beds, the peeling paint, the debris-strewn floors. They documented the patient belongings left behind: a single shoe, a child's doll with a missing eye, a comb lying on a dusty nightstand. They were searching for ghosts, for evidence of the supernatural, for proof that the stories were true. They captured images of strange mists, of orbs of light, of shadows that seemed to move on their own. They were looking for the asylum's afterlife, for the echoes of the pain that had saturated its very walls. But what they were capturing, though they did not know it, was something far more real. They were not just photographing a dead building. They were inadvertently documenting a crime scene, the final resting place of 2,400 souls. Their cameras were awakening the memory of the place, their flashes of light disturbing a darkness that had been left to settle for decades. They thought they were hunting for ghosts, but in truth, they were reopening a case file that the world had tried very hard to keep permanently closed. The asylum was not dead. It was merely sleeping, and it was about to be reawakened. The urban explorers, with their digital cameras and their hunger for the macabre, were the unwitting vanguard. They were followed by a more serious, more methodical kind of investigator. Historians, preservationists, and paranormal researchers who saw, in the decaying asylum, not just a source of cheap thrills, but a site of profound historical and human significance. Armed with blueprints, archival maps, and a battery of modern sensory equipment, they began to peel back the layers of the asylum's silence to conduct a forensic autopsy on the building itself. It was during one of these systematic explorations that a team, acting on a cryptic notation found in the building's original architectural plans, made a discovery that would rewrite the final, tragic chapter of the institution's history. The plans showed an anomaly in the West Wing, a small, unmarked space adjacent to the known location of Dr. Cartwright's office, a void in the blueprints that had no corresponding door or window. They measured the walls, tapped the plaster, and listened for the telltale hollow sound. Behind a section of what appeared to be a solid, load-bearing wall, they found it. A hidden room, its entrance bricked over and plastered so skillfully that it was invisible to the casual eye. With painstaking care, they dismantled the false wall, brick by brick, opening a dark portal into a space that had not seen the light of day in decades. The air that billowed out was cold and sterile, carrying the faint, chemical scent of formaldehyde. The room was not an office or a storage closet. It was a laboratory, but of a different, more gruesome kind than the resonance chamber. It was a specimen room. Lining the walls from floor to ceiling were tall wooden shelves, and upon these shelves sat hundreds of glass jars. They were anatomical jars, the kind used in medical schools to preserve organs for study. But these jars did not contain hearts or lungs or livers. Each one contained a human brain, suspended in a cloudy, yellowish fluid. There were hundreds of them, each jar meticulously labeled, not with a name, but with a case number, etched into a small brass plaque affixed to the lid. The investigators, their flashlight beams dancing across the rows of silent floating specimens, felt a cold, professional dread settle over them. They recognized the numbering system from the asylum's few surviving administrative logs. These were not anonymous anatomical donations. These were the patients. This was the final missing piece of the asylum's population, the quiet, cataloged truth behind the disappearances, the undocumented deaths, the slow, attritional decline of 2,400 souls into a few hundred survivors. This was the doctor's ultimate collection, his library of madness, each brain a volume in a story of systematic human sacrifice. On a small, dusty table in the center of the room, they found a single, larger jar, set apart from the others. Its brass plaque bore no number. It was inscribed with a single, chilling designation: Control Subject. The discovery of the specimen room was a revelation, but it was another, almost accidental finding that provided the final, damning narration. A paranormal investigation team had set up their sensitive audio recording equipment throughout the West Wing, hoping to capture what they called electronic voice phenomena, the disembodied voices of the dead reputedly imprinted on the environment itself. They left their recorders running for days, capturing hours of what was mostly silence: the low moan of the wind through the broken windows, the creak of rotting floorboards. But when they analyzed the recordings from the area directly outside the hidden laboratory, they captured something astonishing. Faintly, buried deep beneath layers of static and ambient noise, they heard a voice. It was a man's voice, calm, educated, and utterly devoid of emotion. It was Dr. Cartwright. They were not recording a ghost. They had captured a residual echo, a phenomenon not of the supernatural, but of physics. The doctor had, in his paranoia, lined the walls of his secret laboratory with a crude form of magnetic shielding to prevent his work from being overheard. This shielding, combined with the unique acoustic properties of the sealed room, had inadvertently created a primitive recording device, trapping the magnetic imprints of the sound waves of his own voice in the metallic dust of the plaster walls. With advanced audio filtering, the investigators were able to isolate and amplify these vocal fragments. They were listening to the doctor's last unedited thoughts, the audio journal he had kept as he worked. They heard him dictating his notes, his voice a calm, clinical drone as he described the process of dissecting a fresh specimen. They heard him musing on the subtle differences in brain tissue between a schizophrenic and a melancholic. They heard him, in one particularly clear and horrifying fragment, express his frustration that the supply of new and interesting pathologies was beginning to dwindle. The recordings were the ravings of a monster, but a monster who believed himself to be a savior. A man who had sacrificed his own humanity, and that of thousands of others, on the altar of a dark and twisted version of scientific progress. The final piece of the puzzle, the narrative thread that tied the hidden room, the disembodied voice, and the fate of every missing patient together, came from the nurse's journal. An academic researcher, cross-referencing the case numbers from the specimen jars with the names and dates in the nurse's secret record, made the ultimate connection. The nurse had not only documented the patients who were taken to the resonance chamber for treatment, she had also, in the final weeks before the fire, begun to notice a new pattern. Certain patients, particularly those who were physically healthy, but displayed what the doctor deemed to be unique psychological profiles, were being transferred to what was officially listed as a new, long-term convalescent ward in the West Wing. It was a ward no one had ever seen, a ward from which no patient ever returned. Her journal listed the names, the dates of transfer, and the chillingly consistent outcome. Each patient was subsequently marked as discharged or lost to administrative error in the official asylum records. She was documenting, without fully understanding it, the systematic harvesting of the doctor's specimens. Her last coherent entry before her description of the asylum's final abandonment contained a single, terrifying question. She had seen the doctor supervising a delivery of a large number of empty glass jars. She asked, in her spidery script, what new kind of treatment requires such vessels? The answer was now horrifyingly clear. The lobotomies, the electroshock, the resonance chamber, these were not the doctor's ultimate experiment. They were merely the preparatory phase. His true work was not in treating the mind, but in collecting it in creating a perfect, orderly, and dead museum of human suffering. The asylum, now a designated historical landmark, stands empty, but it is not silent. To walk its long, cold corridors is to feel the immense, crushing weight of its past. The air is heavy with memory, with the residual psychic energy of the thousands of lives that were lived and lost within its walls. The story of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum is not simply a ghost story, though many claim to see the spectral figure of a nurse making her rounds in the deserted wards, or to hear the faint, disembodied whispers of patients in the empty cells. It is a story about the terrifying ease with which compassion can become control, with which the desire to heal can curdle into an obsession with power. It is a historical case file on the madness not of the patients, but of the healers. A chilling reminder that the greatest horrors are often conceived in the name of progress and enacted in the quiet, sterile rooms of institutions built on a foundation of good intentions. The final revelation is not that a place can be haunted by the spirits of the dead. It is that a place, saturated with so much pain, so much fear, and so much despair, can itself go insane. The 2,400 souls are trapped there still, not by walls or by locks, but by the unerasable memory of what was done to them. They remain, an eternal, silent testament, waiting for their story to be heard. As one looks out from a broken window in the West Wing, a sudden, inexplicable chill might run down the spine. It is a feeling of being watched, of being seen by eyes that are no longer there. And sometimes, on the cold, grimy surface of the glass, a single perfect handprint will appear. A fleeting, ephemeral signature from a soul that has yet to find its peace. They built it to heal the mind. It became a monument to what breaks it. The case file on the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum is now closed. Subscribe to the Blasphemy Archive to stand among those present when the next is opened, and leave your thoughts on what you have witnessed.